this is going to seem like a really strange place to start, so I'm going to ask you to suspend your judgment briefly and to not assume that I'm just exaggerating with these historical analogies that I'm going to draw. Strangely, I want us to start in 15th century Florence, unexpectedly, with a Dominican friar called Savonarola, not pronouncing that correctly probably. And Savonarola, with some of his followers, collected up thousands of books, art, cosmetics, fine dresses, playing cards, all sorts of things that he thought were going to lead the people of Florence to sin. And they put all of these thousands of vanities onto a bonfire. And that's where the relatively famous phrase that you've probably come across a lot recently, particularly in relation to the statues debate, is the idea of the bonfire of vanities. So that to me seems like a very good place to start, because I'm going to tell you just a few historical examples here that I think show that biblioclasm, which is like iconoclasm, but the burning of books or the censorship of books, has a thread running throughout it that is about purity and sin, and trying to, as you alluded to, protect people from ideas or thoughts that might not be good for them, might not be good for society. So one of the first emperor of China, he burned alive 460 scholars for owning forbidden books. In the 1930s, none other than the German Student Union of the National Socialist Party organised a ceremonial book burning in Germany and Austria, multiple ceremonial book burnings, where they burnt books by Jewish authors, communists, Marxists, liberals, pacifists. They burnt the books of people like Victor Hugo, Einstein, D.H. Lawrence, Hemingway, Nabokov, Dostoevsky, Kafka. The list just goes on and on, essentially all of the greatest minds in Western literature, including one lady's books whose name was Helen Keller, who most people have forgotten about now, but she was a disability rights activist, obviously somebody who was very much opposed to the Nazis' eugenicist policies. And Helen Keller wrote an open letter, quite bravely, to the students that were burning her books. And she said, "You may burn my books and the books of the best minds of Europe, but the ideas those books contain have passed through millions of channels and will go on." Fast forwarding slightly to the 60s, the Chinese Cultural Revolution, when the Communist Party wanted to rid China of what they called the Four Olds, ideas, customs, traditions and culture. And they burnt not just books, but also pets, musical instruments. And I think it's quite telling that one of the things that the Chinese Communist Party set fire to were books that recorded family genealogies. Because what they wanted to do, and what many iconoclasts and biblioclasts in revolutionary contexts want to do, is they want to scrub everything from the old society away, so they have a fresh blank slate to build their new revolutionary utopia on. And so that was one of the things that the Chinese communists burnt. Everybody is aware of the famous cases like the Satanic Verses, and I think actually also relevant in this context is the murder of journalists and cartoonists and Charlie Hebdo in 2015 by Islamists. Also people who want to prevent other people from publishing things that they think are, ideas and thoughts that shouldn't be expressed because they're sinful or they're blasphemous or they're harmful in modern social justice activism language. And the purpose, as I said before, and you alluded to this, is to try to root out things that are impure or, may harm people. And so bringing us forward to 2019, this was happened in 2019, but was only reported quite recently, that in Canada and Ontario, many of you will see that they had protests over the last couple of months, which led to churches being set on fire, statues being toppled. But also the Ontario School Board removed 4,700 books from school libraries, children's books of Tintin, Asterix, books most people will have grown up with that you would think have nothing dangerous in them. And amongst this, they also burnt 30 books in what they called a flame purification ritual that was part of the, quote, educational process. And they used the ashes to fertilize a tree. I'm not joking, this isn't satire, this is real, in a program that was called Giving Back to Mother Earth. And instead of condemning this outright, President Trudeau, and Trudeau's classic style, said that he didn't agree with it on a personal level, but he felt that the Indigenous activists who were angry about the content of these books, that, you know, it isn't up to him or Canadian society essentially to tell them how to feel or act. So he didn't defend books against being incinerated in that way. So bringing us back to the subject of publishing in the current context, there was a very interesting article recently published in The Telegraph by Tim Stanley in relation to his new book that is just, I think it may have actually already come out now, called Whatever Happened to Tradition. And he made a really interesting comment in that piece where he said that having, you know, he's probably published hundreds of thousands of words over his career, and he said that he was experiencing a new feeling in relation to this new book being published, and that was fear. And he said it was fear that it would be judged, he said, quote, not on the merits of the argument, but read for the purpose of finding and taking offence. This awful culture must be killing so much art and inquiry. And I think that's the point, is that, you know, I'm going to take you through just a few examples, some of which have already been mentioned, but it's quite clear that in the context of publishing and the decisions that are being made that Ben mentioned, they are stifling thought and art. And in doing so, by creating this paranoia about, and I think anybody who writes will have experienced this, I certainly experienced this myself, is the fear that tomorrow, a week from now, a year from now, the lay of the land will have changed, the fault lines will be different, there will be new tripwires, and people will go back over what you read and judge them by new standards, and you will end up in trouble for something that was perfectly innocuous at the time when you wrote it. And because of that uncertainty, I think many people feel that they have to self-censor because otherwise, you know, they're not going to be safe. So, because I'm lacking in time, I've gone on a bit. I'm just going to mention just a few examples. Kate Clanchy, I think, is a brilliant example of this. Recently, said that she was going to, in the most Orwellian way possible, rewrite her memoir because she'd been picked up for what some people regarded as racist and ableist comments in her book that is very, very well known and well loved by many people. She's very much not a controversial figure, probably on the left, as was Philip Pullman, who defended her. She got in trouble for saying that describing a student that she'd taught as having almond-shaped eyes. The student actually came out and defended that, said that she liked that was something that she's a minority, an ethnic minority within Afghanistan, and she felt that was a nice way, a respectful way of describing her. And her publisher released a statement talking about the anguish and hurt this had caused. And the Orwell Foundation itself also released a statement recognising the concerns and hurt. I mean, you can't get more sort of meta-Orwellian than that. So I'm sure we'll go into it more, but there are so many examples of different publishers who have taken, you know, people's jobs away from them. Gillian Phillips is actually at the conference today. And she's somebody who has had to change career because she was fired from her line of work as a children's author. And you mentioned already Julie Burchill, of course, having a book about cancel culture cancelled. So I think I'll leave it there on that note.
Yeah, we'll come back to that, and thank you. Thank you very much.
Yeah, I think, I mean, there's so much to say, so many good points were made. And I think that, you know, the point of historical comparisons is to illuminate the present by showing up the things that are similar and the things that are not. And obviously any comparison with Nazi book burnings isn't intended to be, as they say, ad Hitlerum. It's intended to show the ways in which there are resonances, because the famous line that history doesn't repeat itself, but it does resonate. And I think that as I mentioned, one of the things that is obviously a constant throughout those historical examples is this desire to uproot things that are seen as in some way blasphemous, you might say. And I do agree that it's not really possible for a publisher to be neutral, in the sense that any publisher, as publishers always have done, need to make certain editorial decisions. But there's a difference between that and making editorial decisions on the basis of an ideology, whether that ideology is a religious puritanism, whether it is to make something aligned with scripture, as has been the case in the past, or whether in the current circumstances it is to align with a very specific social movement and influential ideology. And I think that is what we're seeing in this context. Like, for example, you mentioned them being afraid of the publishers being afraid of their own staff. And as Ben mentioned, but also in addition to that, Jordan Peterson, staff actually crying, almost holding them hostage by weeping over the fact that they work for a publisher who wanted to publish a book that they don't agree with, and describing him as being an icon of hate and transphobia. And even if you look at the accusations against Sally Rooney, who by no means is on the right, she's actually a Marxist. And yes, it is true, it's a piddly small review that didn't really have much of an impact, but there was a review of her book accusing her book Normal People, accusing her of racism because a line in there made some comments about Chinese people, but it was actually made by a relatively abhorrent character who was immediately called out on it. And in this review, the accusations against her were accusations of, whiteness, that all of the characters were able-bodied and so on. And it's always the same sorts of criticisms, and it's because it belongs to this social movement. So I think that is the thing for me that strikes me as being a resonance that should concern us, because it's creating a homogeneity of thought, and it's pushing out dissent, and it's stopping conversations from happening about important issues. And it's going to make all of our literature and art completely banal. You couldn't have Dostoevsky, you couldn't have Nabokov if you didn't have people who were intellectually courageous. And what this is doing is tipping buckets of water over people's intellectual courage by making them afraid to even think, because their thoughts might be, as you say, a thought crime. And I did want to briefly respond to your question about what is it that we can do about this, because I think the one thing that individuals can do is to be courageous. And the Free Speech Union that I work for, we try to give people that courage by letting them know that there is an organisation behind them that will protect them. Like, for example, Gillian Phillips, who was who lost her job for standing with J.K. Rowling on Twitter. Obviously, J.K. Rowling is too big to cancel, but there are lots of people who want to stand up for women's rights who aren't as big as J.K. Rowling. And so I think that there are small acts of courage that can turn the tide. And I think that if it's difficult to say what we can do on a level that isn't individual, because that is a much larger question. But certainly small acts of courage and people willing to take one for the team in some cases, and to know that there are people who will back them, I think that is something that's very important.
Which means we have to start at the other end of the alphabet with...
This is a rarity. I never get to go first on alphabetical... so many good points, and there are so many things that I would like to respond to. I just want to comment on a few sort of disjointed ad hoc points. The point about Amazon and also booksellers, because booksellers do make editorial decisions, you're right, and it also in the window displays that they have, particularly during the Black Lives Matter protests, certain decisions are made. And this has been particularly an issue with books about the trans debate, people like Deborah So, and others who have had their books removed either from, in the US, shops like Target, or from Amazon, and with employees or groups pressuring companies like Amazon to make certain decisions about how they advertise those books, whether they, how they are accessed, removing advertising revenue, things like that affect the publisher, and therefore would discourage the publisher from publishing material like that in the future on the basis that there are complaints that material might be transphobic and so on. And I'm thinking particularly of one example. A good friend of mine who is an American journalist published a book that had protests outside of this American bookshop calling him a fascist and trying, because he was reporting on something they didn't want him to report on. Protesting against it. The bookstore didn't remove it from the catalogue, but they did make the decision to remove it from the shelves and to not promote it in the way they would promote other books. And then they released a statement about it. And this was actually a bookshop that had been in trouble previously in relation to Salman Rushdie and had stood up for the right to continue selling that kind of book. I think the point about sensitivity readers was also a very good one, because that is something that is really quite concerning, that you basically have to cancel proof your book. And there have been cases where books have gone back to the sensitivity readers, and what it does is it creates a kind of radical subjectivism where you're only allowed to talk or write about a subject that is very narrowly related to identity categories that are being foisted on you by others. Because if you take this ad absurdum, then you end up with only being able to write things that are purely autobiographical. Either that, or you have to conform to identity categories that you didn't decide for yourself should be the thing that defines you, which goes back to a lot of what you were saying earlier as well. I think just two things that I want to come in very briefly on. I think that the way that you phrased that there was perfect, that the kingdom is smaller now, that this is creating a stifling atmosphere for young minds, for schools and for teachers. And I know certainly that, as someone who went to a state school and, accessed the intellectual world through the school library and through my teachers, that, that is a life-changing thing to narrow someone's world in that way. And I actually think it's an injustice. I think it's a form of cruelty. And I just very briefly want to come back to your question about where is this going. I think that is a really good question, and it's so difficult to know in which direction the wind is blowing. They seem to change so quickly. I had this conversation quite recently with one particular very well-established thinker about what will be the tripwires around the bend. Will it be something relating to sexuality? What's going to be the next taboo? And now I don't have an answer to what that will be, because every time I try to guess what's going to happen in the future, I'm always wrong. I thought coronavirus wasn't going to be a big thing. But I do think that the fact that we are asking that question, and I think everybody is asking that question privately, every time you tweet something about anything that may even be a complete non-issue, around the bend it turns out to be something big. And I mentioned Sally Rooney partly because her book was published in 2018, and Nick Cohen wrote a very interesting article in The Guardian saying that this was at a time before cancel culture turned into an inquisition. She couldn't have known someone was going to go sort of nitpicking through everything that she'd ever written in order to try and find some kind of thought crime, something that might be tangentially related to something bad or sort of thought crime adjacent. And so I think it's a really good question, but the question itself sort of indicates the heart of the problem.
It sounds like a new dystopia.